Welcome, weary wanderer of the atomic age, to a gentle journey across the irradiated globe. Tonight, we explore what became of every nation when the Great War of 2077 transformed our world into something unrecognizable. As nuclear fire consumed not just America, but every corner of our planet, civilizations fell, and new ones rose from the ashes in ways both tragic and beautiful. So settle into comfort, let your breathing slow, and allow your mind to drift across continents and oceans as we discover together how humanity endured in the shadow of atomic winter. Close your eyes when you're ready, and let us begin our peaceful pilgrimage through the post-war world. Let your thoughts drift northward now, across the invisible line that once separated two nations but became meaningless when atomic fire consumed the world. The land that was once Canada stretches before us in the pale morning light, its familiar geography transformed by decades of nuclear winter and human adaptation. Here, where maple leaves once turned crimson in peaceful autumns, a different kind of red now stains the snow, the rust of abandoned weapons and the dried blood of territorial wars that never seem to end. The story of Canada's transformation begins not with the bombs themselves, but with the years of occupation that preceded them. By 2077, the United States had ceased to view its northern neighbor as a sovereign nation and had begun treating it as simply another territory to be exploited for the war effort. The annexation was not a single dramatic event, but a gradual strangulation of Canadian independence, conducted with the methodical efficiency that characterized American resource acquisition during those final desperate years. American military bases dotted the Canadian landscape like cancerous growths, each one a hub of weapons production and strategic planning for the war against China. The transformation was most visible in the industrial centers, where Canadian factories were retooled to serve American military needs rather than civilian populations. Workers who had once produced automobiles and consumer goods found themselves assembling rifles and artillery shells for a war they had not chosen to fight. The Long Branch Arsenal represented the pinnacle of this industrial transformation, a massive weapons manufacturing complex that stretched across acres of what had once been peaceful farmland. The facility specialized in producing the 12.7mm rifles that would later become legendary throughout the post-war wasteland, weapons so well crafted that they continued to function decades after the civilization that created them had turned to ash. The arsenal operated around the clock during those final months before the war, its smokestacks painting the sky with industrial haze while trains loaded with weapons departed for the front lines in Alaska and China. Canadian workers at facilities like Long Branch found themselves in an impossible position, caught between American overseers who demanded increased production and their own growing resentment at seeing their homeland transformed into a weapons factory. Strikes and sabotage became common, leading to increasingly harsh crackdowns by American military police. The atmosphere in occupied Canada grew more oppressive with each passing month, as American authorities struggled to maintain production quotas while dealing with a population that had never wanted to be part of their empire. The weapons produced in Canadian factories were not just quantity over quality mass productions, but represented some of the finest military equipment ever manufactured in North America. German weapons might have dominated the international arms trade, but Canadian-made firearms possessed a reliability and stopping power that made them prized possessions among those who could acquire them. The craftsmanship reflected not just superior industrial capabilities, but a grim determination among Canadian workers to create something that would outlast the political system that oppressed them. When the bombs finally fell on October 23, 2077, Canada received fewer direct hits than the United States mainland, but the devastation was still catastrophic. Major cities like Ottawa, Montreal, and Vancouver disappeared in pillars of atomic fire, while smaller urban centers suffered varying degrees of destruction depending on their strategic importance to the American war machine. The Long Branch arsenal itself was targeted early in the exchange, presumably by Chinese missiles seeking to eliminate weapons production capabilities, leaving behind a radioactive crater where thousands of workers had labored until the final moments. The immediate aftermath of the nuclear exchange left Canada in a state of chaos that made the American wasteland look organized by comparison. With both the American occupation forces and the remnants of the Canadian government effectively destroyed, local communities were forced to fend for themselves, using whatever resources they could scavenge from military installations and weapons factories. The abundance of military hardware scattered across the landscape created a unique dynamic in the Canadian wasteland, where even small communities could possess firepower that would make them regional powers. The city that would eventually become known as Ronto emerged from the ashes of Toronto with advantages that most post-war settlements could only dream of possessing. Located far enough from ground zero to avoid complete destruction, but close enough to major military installations to inherit substantial weapons stockpiles. The survivors who gathered in Toronto's ruins found themselves in possession of an arsenal that included everything from small arms to heavy artillery. The city's position on the shores of Lake Ontario also provided access to fresh water and potential trade routes with other surviving communities. The transformation of Toronto into Ronto reflected the broader changes occurring throughout the Canadian wasteland, where survivors adapted not just to radiation and resource scarcity, but to a fundamentally militarized society. The abundance of weapons made peaceful coexistence difficult, as communities with access to military hardware quickly discovered that negotiation was less effective than intimidation when dealing with disputes over territory and resources. The strong preyed upon the weak with an efficiency that would have impressed the American robber barons of centuries past. Ronto's rise to prominence as a regional power was built on its ability to maintain and repair the sophisticated weapons systems inherited from pre-war military installations. While other communities struggled to keep simple firearms functional, Ronto's workshops could rebuild automatic weapons and even manufacture ammunition using salvaged materials and improvised techniques. This technological advantage allowed them to project power far beyond their immediate territory, establishing trade relationships and tributary arrangements with smaller settlements throughout the Great Lakes region. The military culture that dominated Ronto and similar Canadian settlements was not simply a reaction to post-war dangers, but reflected the deeper changes that occupation had wrought in Canadian society. The generation that came of age during the American annexation had learned that survival required not just individual resilience but collective organization for warfare. They had watched their parents submit to foreign authority and had resolved that their own communities would never again be vulnerable to outside domination. The raiders of Pittsburgh discovered in Ronto not just a trading partner but a kindred spirit in the art of organized violence. The steel mills of Pennsylvania produced the raw materials that Ronto's workshops could transform into finished weapons, creating a symbiotic relationship that spanned hundreds of miles of dangerous wasteland. Caravans traveling between the two cities required heavy military escorts, but the profits from the arms trade justified the risks and expenses involved in maintaining these long-distance commercial relationships. The weapons that flowed south from Ronto carried more than just destructive potential. They carried the legacy of Canadian craftsmanship and the bitter memories of occupation and nuclear devastation. A 12.7mm rifle manufactured in the Long Branch arsenal and later refurbished in Ronto's workshops represented not just superior firepower but a connection to the industrial heritage that had defined Canada during its final years as an independent nation. These weapons were treasures that could determine the outcome of conflicts throughout the post-war world. The bastardization of place names that occurred throughout the post-war world was particularly pronounced in the Canadian wasteland, where survivors often lacked the education or cultural continuity to preserve the proper pronunciation and spelling of their communities. Toronto became Ronto through this process of linguistic decay, just as countless other settlements saw their names simplified or corrupted through generations of oral transmission among populations struggling with basic literacy. These changes reflected not just practical concerns but the psychological need to create new identities distinct from the pre-war world that had failed so catastrophically. The nuclear winter that settled over the Canadian landscape in the months following the Great War created environmental challenges that made the American wastelands problems seem manageable by comparison. The combination of northern latitude and nuclear fallout produced a climate where summer temperatures rarely rose above freezing, and winter brought conditions that could kill an unprepared traveler within hours. Communities that had survived the initial nuclear exchange found themselves facing slow starvation as agricultural production became impossible, and wildlife populations crashed under the combined pressures of radiation and extreme cold. The polar bears of the Canadian Arctic, already among the most dangerous predators on the continent before the war, underwent mutations in the post-nuclear environment that transformed them into creatures of nightmare. The combination of radiation exposure and the expanded range made possible by permanent winter conditions created bear populations that could venture far south of their traditional territories while growing to sizes that dwarfed their permanent pre-war ancestors. These mutated giants possessed not just increased physical strength but heightened aggression and reduced fear of humans, making them apex predators in an environment where even heavily armed settlements struggled to defend themselves. The psychological impact of encountering these mutated bears went beyond simple fear of physical harm to touch something deeper in the human psyche. For survivors who had grown up hearing stories of the relatively benign wildlife that had existed before the war, the sight of a 12-foot-tall bear with glowing eyes and radiation-scarred fur represented a fundamental violation of the natural order. These creatures became symbols of how completely the nuclear exchange had transformed the world, creating new forms of life that were hostile to human existence in ways that evolution had never intended. Communities throughout the Canadian wasteland developed elaborate defensive strategies specifically designed to deal with the bear threat. Settlements learned to construct walls and barriers that could withstand not just human raiders, but creatures possessing the strength to literally tear buildings apart. The weapons trade between Ronto and other regional powers was driven partly by the need for firearms powerful enough to stop mutated bears before they could close to melee range, creating a market for heavy rifles and specialized ammunition that commanded premium prices. The hunting of mutated bears became both a necessity for community defense and a source of prestige for the most skilled marksmen in the Canadian wasteland. Bear hunters who could consistently take down these massive predators were valued members of their communities, often serving as both protectors and celebrities. The fur, meat, and other materials harvested from successful hunts provided resources that could not be obtained through any other means, making bear hunting an essential component of post-war survival despite its extraordinary dangers. The social dynamics that developed around bear hunting reflected broader changes in Canadian post-war culture, where individual courage and martial prowess became more highly valued than the peaceful virtues that had characterized pre-war society. Communities organized themselves around the need to defend against both human and animal threats, creating hierarchies based on combat effectiveness rather than the democratic principles that had once governed Canadian political life. The strong led while the weak followed, and those who could not contribute to the collective defense often found themselves expelled to face the wasteland alone. The trade networks that connected Ronto with distant settlements required not just economic incentives, but military logistics capable of moving goods through territory infested with mutated predators and human raiders. Caravans traveling between major settlements resembled military expeditions more than commercial ventures, with heavily armed escorts outnumbering the actual traders by ratios that would have been unthinkable in the pre-war world. The cost of protection was factored into every transaction, making long-distance trade a high-risk, high-reward activity that only the most desperate or most confident merchants were willing to attempt. The weapons that formed the backbone of Canadian trade were not just functional tools, but works of art that reflected the pride and skill of their creators. The craftsmen who had learned their trade in pre-war factories brought their expertise to post-war workshops, creating firearms that combined practical effectiveness with aesthetic beauty. A rifle manufactured in Ronto was not just a weapon but a status symbol that announced its owner's prosperity and connections to one of the most powerful communities in the northern wasteland. The ammunition manufacturing that supported the Canadian arms trade required access to raw materials and chemical processes that were difficult to maintain in post-war conditions. Communities like Ronto invested heavily in preserving and expanding their industrial capabilities, often at the expense of other development priorities. The ability to produce bullets, powder, and primers was worth more than gold in a world where ammunition determined the difference between survival and extinction. These industrial capabilities became closely guarded secrets that communities protected with the same intensity they devoted to defending their physical territories. The climate changes that accompanied nuclear winter had unexpected benefits for some aspects of Canadian survival, particularly in the realm of food preservation. The perpetual cold that made agriculture impossible also meant that meat could be stored for extended periods without spoilage, allowing successful hunting expeditions to provide sustenance for entire communities over weeks or months. The traditional skills of ice fishing and cold weather hunting that had characterized pre-war Canadian culture found new relevance in a world where these activities often represented the difference between starvation and survival. The psychological challenges of living in permanent winter conditions affected Canadian survivors in ways that were not immediately apparent but became more pronounced over time. The lack of seasonal variation and the absence of spring's renewal created depression and hopelessness that undermined community morale and individual motivation. Settlements learned to create artificial celebrations and rituals that provided psychological relief from the endless grey skies and frozen landscape, often incorporating elements of pre-war Canadian holidays modified to reflect post-war realities. The preservation of Canadian cultural identity in the post-war world became a conscious effort that required deliberate choices about which traditions to maintain and which to abandon. Communities that successfully preserved elements of their pre-war heritage often found these cultural connections provided psychological resilience that purely survival-focused groups lacked. The maple leaf symbol, the memory of hockey games, and fragments of Canadian songs and stories became talismans against the despair that threatened to consume survivors who had lost everything else that had once defined their identity. As the decades passed and the immediate crisis of post-war survival gave way to more stable forms of existence, the Canadian wasteland began to develop its own unique character distinct from both its pre-war past and the American wasteland to the south. The combination of abundant weapons, extreme climate, and the legacy of military occupation created a society where strength was respected above all other virtues, where communities prospered through conquest rather than cooperation, and where the harsh landscape bred people as hard and unforgiving as the environment that shaped them. The children born into this world knew nothing of the peaceful, prosperous Canada that had existed before the annexation and the bombs, but they inherited both the skills necessary to survive in their transformed homeland and the cultural memory of a people who had once been free. Their future would be written in the snow and blood of the northern wasteland, where polar bears the size of buildings stalked settlements armed with weapons that could level city blocks, and where survival required not just individual courage, but collective organization for endless war against both human enemies and the hostile environment that the nuclear exchange had created in the land that was once called Canada. Now let us journey south, following trade routes carved by necessity through landscapes still glowing with atomic fire, to the land where ancient civilizations once flourished before conquistadors brought European disease, and where nuclear war brought devastation beyond anything the Spanish colonizers could have imagined. The nation that was once Mexico stretches before us like a fever dream painted in shades of radiation green and desert gold, its familiar geography transformed by the most insidious weapon in humanity's atomic arsenal. Mexico's story of destruction began not with the bombs themselves, but with the systematic exploitation that preceded them. A process of resource extraction so thorough that it left the nation economically gutted even before the first nuclear warhead found its target. The Second Mexican-American War had been less a conflict between equals than a predatory assault designed to strip every valuable mineral, every drop of oil, every gram of precious metal from Mexican soil. By 2077, Mexico existed as little more than an empty shell, its resources flowing north to feed the American war machine, while its people were left to subsist on the scraps of their former prosperity. The American occupation of Mexico during those final pre-war years was characterized by an efficiency that made the conquest of Canada look gentle by comparison. Where Canadian annexation had at least maintained a pretense of political integration, the Mexican subjugation was openly acknowledged as resource colonialism conducted through military force. American mining operations scarred the landscape while American drilling rigs pumped the last of Mexico's oil reserves north through pipelines guarded by soldiers who shot civilians for approaching too close to the infrastructure that was bleeding their homeland dry. The Mexican people who witnessed this systematic looting of their nation's wealth understood that they were watching the death of their country in slow motion, but they were powerless to resist forces that possessed overwhelming technological and military advantages. The corruption of local officials who collaborated with American extraction efforts created a climate of mistrust and despair that would outlast the war itself, poisoning relationships between communities and undermining the social cohesion that might otherwise have helped Mexico recover from the devastation that was to come. When the nuclear exchange finally began on October 23, 2077, Mexico received fewer direct hits than either the United States or China, but the weapons that did find their targets were chosen with malicious precision to maximize long-term suffering rather than immediate military effectiveness. The attack on Mexico City represented not just the destruction of a capital, but the deployment of a weapon so cruel that it violated every principle of warfare that civilized nations had once claimed to respect. The cobalt bomb that detonated above Mexico City was designed not to destroy buildings, but to poison the air itself, releasing radioactive particles that would remain lethal for generations rather than the relatively short half-life of conventional nuclear fallout. The explosion itself was almost anticlimactic, a flash of light that seemed less intense than the atomic weapons used elsewhere, but the invisible death that followed would prove more devastating than any conventional bombardment could have achieved. The radioactive fog that settled over the city was not just immediately lethal, but would remain dangerous for decades, transforming the heart of Mexican civilization into a wasteland that could not be reclaimed or rebuilt. The choice to use a cobalt bomb against Mexico City revealed the depths of cruelty that the resource wars had cultivated in military planners who had learned to view civilian populations as acceptable casualties in the pursuit of strategic objectives. The weapon served no military purpose that could not have been achieved with conventional nuclear warheads, but it ensured that Mexico's largest population center would remain uninhabitable for generations, preventing any possibility of rapid recovery that might threaten American interests in the region. It was genocide conducted through physics rather than gas chambers, but genocide nonetheless. The immediate aftermath of the cobalt bombing created scenes of horror that survivors would carry in their memories for the rest of their lives. The radioactive fog that descended upon Mexico City was invisible but deadly, killing thousands who did not even realize they had been exposed until the radiation sickness began to manifest hours or days later. Families fled the city only to discover that they carried death with them in their clothing and hair, spreading contamination to communities that had initially escaped the bombing. The exodus from the capital became a diaspora of the dying as refugees spread radiation poisoning throughout central Mexico while seeking sanctuary that did not exist. The gangs that had operated in Mexico's cities during the final years before the war were uniquely positioned to exploit the chaos that followed the nuclear attack. Unlike the government officials who fled or died in the bombing, and unlike the military units that disintegrated when their chain of command was severed, the criminal organizations possessed the flexibility and ruthlessness necessary to adapt quickly to post-war conditions. They had always operated outside legal authority, so the collapse of formal government meant little to them. They had always resolved disputes through violence, so the breakdown of civil order played to their strengths. The transformation of criminal gangs into raider armies was not immediate, but occurred through a process of consolidation and militarization that took place over the months and years following the nuclear exchange. Smaller gangs were absorbed by larger ones through conquest or alliance, while leadership positions went to those who could demonstrate effectiveness in the new environment of constant warfare and resource scarcity. The successful gang leaders who emerged from this period of consolidation were not just criminals but military commanders who understood logistics, strategy, and the psychology of terror. The raider armies that emerged from this process bore little resemblance to the pre-war gangs from which they had evolved. They possessed military-grade weapons looted from abandoned bases, organizational structures that enabled them to coordinate complex operations across vast territories, and most importantly, a ruthlessness that had been honed through years of preying upon the weak and defenseless. These were not desperate survivors engaging in opportunistic violence, but professional predators who had chosen to build their power through the systematic exploitation of others' suffering. The refugees fleeing Mexico City and other contaminated areas provided both victims and recruits for the expanding raider armies. Those who possessed nothing but their own lives often found themselves forced to choose between joining the gangs or becoming their prey. The choice was rarely difficult to make, especially for young men who had lost everything in the nuclear exchange and saw violence as the only path to acquiring the resources necessary for survival. The raider armies grew through recruitment as much as conquest, absorbing desperate survivors who gradually adopted the values and methods of their new communities. The radiation poisoning that spread from Mexico City created not just immediate casualties, but long-term changes in the human population that would define Mexican society for generations. The massive ghoul population that emerged from the most heavily contaminated areas represented both a tragedy and a resource, as these transformed humans possessed immunity to further radiation exposure that made them valuable in environments where normal humans could not survive. The ghouls became a permanent underclass in post-war Mexican society, often enslaved by human communities, but occasionally forming their own settlements in areas too radioactive for their unmodified cousins to inhabit. The social dynamics that developed around the ghoul population reflected the broader breakdown of moral constraints that characterized post-war Mexico. Communities that had once prided themselves on their humanity found themselves treating their former neighbors as subhuman when radiation transformed their appearance and, in some cases, their mental faculties. The discrimination against ghouls was not just prejudice but economic calculation, as their radiation immunity made them valuable for dangerous work that would kill normal humans. Ghoul slavery became one of the foundations of post-war Mexican society, a system of exploitation that would have horrified pre-war observers, but seemed natural to survivors who had learned to view human life as just another commodity to be bought and sold. The northern migration that followed the Mexican nuclear attacks was not a single mass movement, but a decades-long process of gradual population shift as survivors sought to escape the radiation that made their traditional homelands uninhabitable. The migrants carried with them not just their possessions but their cultural traditions and survival skills, creating diaspora communities throughout the American Southwest that preserved Mexican identity while adapting to new environments and circumstances. These communities often served as bridges between the post-war American and Mexican wastelands, facilitating trade and communication between regions that might otherwise have remained isolated. The experience of pre-war resource scarcity and political instability that had characterized late Mexican history provided these survivors with advantages that populations from more stable nations lacked. They had already learned to make do with less, to create functional communities despite unreliable infrastructure, and to maintain cultural cohesion in the face of external pressures. The skills that had enabled Mexican communities to survive American exploitation proved equally valuable for surviving nuclear devastation, giving Mexican survivors a resilience that impressed even hardened wasteland veterans. The agricultural knowledge that Mexican farmers had accumulated over centuries of working difficult land became invaluable in the post-war environment, where the ability to grow food in contaminated soil could mean the difference between community survival and slow starvation. Traditional techniques for water conservation, crop rotation, and soil management proved remarkably effective when applied to the challenges of farming in radioactive environments. Mexican settlements often achieved food security more quickly than their neighbors, because they possessed cultural knowledge that had been developed specifically for harsh conditions. The new California Republic's expansion into the Baja Peninsula represented a collision between two different approaches to post-war survival and governance. The NCR brought with it the organizational advantages of a centralized government and the technological resources of a society that had successfully rebuilt industrial capabilities. The Mexican communities they encountered possessed the advantages of local knowledge, environmental adaptation, and the guerrilla warfare experience that comes from generations of resisting more powerful enemies. The resulting conflict combined conventional military operations with insurgency tactics in ways that made progress slow and costly for both sides. The guerrilla war that developed in Baja demonstrated the continuing relevance of traditional Mexican military culture, which had always emphasized mobility, local support, and the willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. The Mexican fighters who resisted NCR expansion were not just defending territory, but preserving a way of life that had evolved specifically to survive in harsh conditions through community cooperation and shared hardship. Their effectiveness against a technologically superior enemy proved that the lessons learned during centuries of foreign invasion retained their value in the post-war world. The weapons and equipment captured from NCR forces provided Mexican resistance fighters with access to advanced technology that few post-war communities possessed. The ability to maintain and repair these sophisticated systems required technical knowledge that became a valuable commodity throughout the Mexican wasteland. Communities that could field NCR-quality equipment while retaining the tactical flexibility of guerrilla fighters possessed significant advantages over enemies who relied on either superior technology or superior numbers alone. The pollution and radiation that flowed south from the enclave's operations on the American West Coast created environmental challenges that compounded the problems Mexico had inherited from its own nuclear bombardment. The coastal waters that had once provided protein and transportation became toxic wastelands where mutated sea life preyed upon anything foolish enough to venture too close to the water's edge. The fishing communities that had sustained themselves for generations found their traditional livelihood transformed into a deadly occupation that required elaborate safety precautions and often resulted in radiation poisoning despite all precautions. The marine mutations that emerged from the contaminated coastal waters represented some of the most dangerous creatures in the post-war world, combining the natural predatory instincts of ocean life with the enhanced aggression and physical capabilities that radiation exposure often produced. The exact nature of these creatures remained largely unknown, as few who encountered them survived to provide detailed descriptions. The stories told by coastal survivors spoke of tentacled horrors that could drag entire boats beneath the waves, of fish with teeth-like swords that could bite through metal, and of creatures so bizarre that they seemed to violate the basic principles of biology. The coastal communities that had once thrived on fishing and maritime trade found themselves forced to abandon their traditional ways of life or risk extinction from the contaminated environment. Some settlements moved inland, establishing new communities far from the poisoned waters but losing their cultural connection to the sea that had defined their identity for generations. Others adapted by developing new technologies and techniques for dealing with the radioactive marine environment, creating hazmat suits from salvaged materials and learning to identify which areas of the coast were merely dangerous rather than immediately lethal. The economic impact of losing coastal resources was severe for Mexican communities that had depended on maritime activities for their survival. The trade networks that had connected coastal settlements with inland communities were disrupted, forcing local economies to become more self-sufficient while losing access to resources that could only be obtained from the sea. The salt harvesting operations that had provided this essential commodity to large areas of Mexico became impossible when the evaporation ponds became too radioactive to approach safely. The cultural preservation efforts that characterized post-war Mexican communities reflected a conscious decision to maintain identity and traditions despite the pressures of survival in a transformed world. Language, music, religious practices, and social customs were carefully maintained even when their practical value was questionable, because they provided psychological stability and community cohesion that proved essential for long-term survival. The festivals and ceremonies that marked important events in community life served not just as entertainment, but as reinforcement of shared values and collective identity. The religious faith that had sustained Mexican communities through centuries of hardship took on new significance in the post-war world, where traditional explanations for suffering and injustice seemed inadequate to address the scale of devastation that had befallen the world. The Catholic churches that survived the nuclear exchange became centers not just for worship, but for community organization, education, and mutual aid. The priests and other religious leaders who maintained their flocks through the worst years of post-war chaos often became political leaders as well, providing both spiritual guidance and practical administration for communities struggling to rebuild. The artistic traditions that had flourished in pre-war Mexico continued to evolve in the post-war environment, incorporating new themes and materials that reflected the changed circumstances of their creators. The murals that decorated buildings in surviving communities often depicted not just traditional subjects but scenes from the nuclear war and its aftermath, serving both as historical record and as emotional processing for trauma that was too great for words alone to express. The music that emerged from post-war Mexican settlements combined traditional forms with new lyrics that spoke of loss, survival, and hope for eventual recovery. The medical knowledge that Mexican communities had developed for treating radiation exposure became valuable throughout the post-war world, as their experience with the aftermath of cobalt bombing provided insights that few other populations possessed. The herbal remedies and traditional treatments that had been dismissed by pre-war medical establishments proved surprisingly effective for managing radiation sickness and other post-war ailments. The curanderas and other traditional healers who had maintained their practices despite modern medical advances found their skills in high demand when high-tech medicine was no longer available. The children who grew up in post-war Mexico inherited both the trauma of nuclear devastation and the resilience that had enabled their communities to survive impossible circumstances. Their education combined practical survival skills with cultural traditions, creating a generation that was simultaneously rooted in Mexican heritage and adapted to post-war realities. These children would carry forward not just the memory of what had been lost, but the knowledge of how to build something new from the ashes of the old world. The trading relationships that developed between Mexican settlements and other post-war communities reflected both the resources that Mexico could offer and the goods that its people needed for continued survival and growth. The agricultural products that Mexican farmers could grow in contaminated soil were valuable throughout the wasteland, while the crafted goods produced by Mexican artisans commanded premium prices from collectors who appreciated their beauty and workmanship. The caravans that carried these goods across dangerous territories were protected by guards who combined traditional Mexican fighting techniques with weapons and tactics learned through decades of post-war conflict. As the decades passed and the immediate crisis of survival gave way to more stable forms of existence, the Mexican wasteland began to develop its own character distinct from both its glorious pre-war past and the other post-war societies emerging around the globe. The combination of ancient cultural wisdom and hard-won survival experience created communities that were simultaneously traditional and innovative, preserving the best of their heritage while adapting to the challenges of their transformed world. The radioactive fog that had once threatened to destroy Mexican civilization had instead forged it into something harder and more resilient, a culture that could face any future challenge with the quiet confidence that comes from having survived the absolute worst that human cruelty and natural disaster could combine to create. Turn your attention now to the vast green hell that stretches across the southern continent, where nuclear fire proved to be only the beginning of devastation rather than its climax. The lands that were once Central and South America spread before us like a fever dream of twisted vegetation and endless warfare. Their familiar geography transformed not by atomic bombs alone, but by the conventional conflicts that followed in their wake. Here, where ancient civilizations had once flourished in harmony with jungle and mountain, the end of the world came not with a single flash of light, but through decades of burning forests and brother fighting brother over the scraps of a poisoned earth. The initial nuclear exchange had spared much of Central and South America from direct atomic attack, their governments having maintained careful neutrality during the escalating tensions between the United States and China. But this apparent mercy proved to be a cruel deception, for the devastation that followed would be more thorough and more lasting than any nuclear bombardment could have achieved. The few warheads that did find targets in major capitals and military installations served not as instruments of destruction but as sparks that ignited conflicts already smoldering beneath the surface of societies strained beyond their breaking point. The resource wars that had consumed the Northern Hemisphere had not left South America untouched, despite the continent's official neutrality in the great power conflicts. The demand for oil, minerals, and agricultural products had drawn every South American nation into the global web of resource extraction and economic exploitation that characterized the final years before the Great War. When the nuclear exchange severed these trade relationships overnight, the sudden collapse of export markets created economic chaos that no government in the region was prepared to handle. The military dictatorships that had dominated South American politics during the late 21st century found themselves facing simultaneous crises that tested every aspect of their authoritarian control. The collapse of international trade eliminated the revenue streams that had funded their armies and secret police, while the obvious failure of Northern Hemisphere civilization undermined their claims to represent stability and progress. The popular uprisings that followed were not coordinated revolutionary movements, but spontaneous expressions of rage from populations that had endured decades of oppression, only to watch the world end while their leaders counted profits from resource exports. The conventional wars that erupted across the continent in the months following the Great War were fought with an intensity and brutality that made the nuclear exchange seem almost civilized by comparison. These were not conflicts between professional armies following established rules of warfare, but desperate struggles between rival groups of survivors, each convinced that their opponent's elimination was necessary for their own survival. The weapons were conventional, but their employment was total, with no distinction made between military and civilian targets and no quarter given to those who surrendered. The fighting was most intense in the oil-producing regions of Venezuela and Colombia, where rival factions sought to control the refineries and pipelines that represented the last functional industrial infrastructure on the continent. The crude oil that had once been exported to fuel the war machines of distant superpowers became the prize in local conflicts that raged for years, with control of individual oil wells changing hands dozens of times as different armies advanced and retreated across the petroleum-soaked landscape. The blazing oil wells that resulted from these conflicts created environmental devastation that rivaled anything the nuclear powers had achieved through their atomic weapons. The fires burned for months or even years, fed by reservoirs of petroleum that seemed inexhaustible until they were finally consumed in pillars of flame that could be seen from orbit. The smoke from these infernos mixed with radioactive fallout from distant nuclear detonations, creating atmospheric conditions that blocked sunlight and disrupted weather patterns across the entire continent. The Amazon rainforest, which had served as the lungs of the planet for millions of years, became the primary victim of the conventional wars that followed the nuclear exchange. The massive forest fires that consumed thousands of square miles of jungle were not accidents or natural disasters, but deliberate acts of warfare conducted by military commanders who understood that controlling territory meant denying it to their enemies, even if that denial required its complete destruction. The ancient trees that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash in conflicts that lasted mere weeks. The transformation of the Amazon from a life-giving ecosystem into a blazing hell reflected the broader changes that war had wrought in human thinking about the natural world. The environmental consciousness that had once characterized South American indigenous cultures was abandoned by survivors who viewed nature not as a partner to be respected, but as a resource to be consumed or destroyed according to immediate tactical needs. The forest became just another battlefield, its destruction merely collateral damage in conflicts whose participants had forgotten why they were fighting. The radioactive soot that settled over the burning Amazon created contamination patterns that defied prediction or mapping, as winds and rainfall carried fallout in directions determined by weather systems disrupted by the massive fires themselves. The ash that fell on surviving vegetation carried not just the carbon residue of burned trees, but particles of radioactive material that had traveled thousands of miles from nuclear detonation sites in the northern hemisphere. This invisible contamination would influence the evolution of plant and animal life for generations to come. The regrowth that eventually began in areas where the fires had finally burned themselves out was unlike anything that had existed in the Amazon's long history. The new vegetation that took root in the radioactive ash displayed mutations that challenged basic assumptions about how plants were supposed to function. Some species developed carnivorous adaptations that allowed them to derive nutrients from animal protein rather than relying solely on photosynthesis. Others grew to sizes that their root systems should not have been able to support, creating canopies that blocked so much sunlight that the forest floor became perpetually dark. The carnivorous plants that evolved in the post-war Amazon were not merely biological curiosities, but active threats to human survival that made travel through the regrown forest areas extraordinarily dangerous. These adaptations ranged from subtle modifications to existing plant structures to completely new forms of life that seemed to violate fundamental principles of botany. Vines developed thorns that could inject paralytic toxins into animals that brushed against them. Flowers produced pheromones that could disorient mammals and lead them into pit traps lined with digestive enzymes. The most terrifying of these plant mutations were the species that developed active hunting behaviors, using mobile root systems or projectile seeds to capture prey at distances that allowed them to feed on animals too large to be trapped by conventional plant mechanisms. These hunter plants pose particular dangers to human survivors because their attack methods were unlike anything that human instincts were prepared to recognize or counter. A tree that could launch poisonous thorns with sufficient force to penetrate body armor represented a fundamental violation of the natural order that left survivors psychologically as well as physically vulnerable. The animal life that adapted to the transformed Amazon underwent mutations that were equally dramatic and often more immediately dangerous to human survivors. The snakes that had always been among the forest's most formidable predators grew to sizes that allowed them to threaten not just individual humans but entire small communities. These giant serpents developed hunting strategies that took advantage of their increased size, using their massive bodies to crush buildings or encircle groups of people rather than relying on the bite and constrict methods of their smaller ancestors. The giant snakes that emerged from the radioactive jungle were not just larger versions of existing species, but represented entirely new evolutionary developments that combined the predatory efficiency of reptiles with intelligence levels that approached those of mammals. These creatures learned to use tools and coordinate their attacks in ways that made them far more dangerous than their size alone would suggest. They demonstrated problem-solving abilities that allowed them to overcome human defenses that would have been effective against conventional animals. The fungal infections that spread through both the plant and animal populations of the post-war Amazon represented perhaps the most insidious threat to emerge from the transformed ecosystem. These organisms, which may have been mutated versions of pre-war species or entirely new life forms created by the interaction of radiation with existing fungal spores, possessed the ability to control the behavior of their hosts in ways that served the fungus's reproductive needs rather than the host's survival instincts. The spore clouds that these fungi released during their reproductive cycles created zones of infection that could transform human survivors into zombie-like creatures whose behavior was controlled by parasitic organisms rather than conscious decision-making. The infected individuals retained their basic motor functions and much of their knowledge, making them particularly dangerous because they could use tools and weapons while being completely devoted to spreading the infection that controlled them. Communities that encountered these fungal zombies often had difficulty recognizing the threat until the infection had already spread to multiple individuals. The psychological impact of encountering fungal zombies was particularly devastating for survivors who recognized the infected individuals as former friends or family members. The knowledge that the attacking creature had once been a loved one, combined with uncertainty about whether any trace of the original personality remained conscious within the parasitized body, created moral dilemmas that were almost impossible to resolve. Communities were forced to develop protocols for dealing with potentially infected members, creating a climate of suspicion and fear that undermined the social cohesion necessary for long-term survival. The underground cities that developed in areas where surface conditions became completely uninhabitable represented remarkable achievements in post-war engineering and social organization. These subterranean communities were carved from existing cave systems or created through elaborate excavation projects that required coordination between dozens of families and work groups. The technical challenges of providing ventilation, water, and sanitation for underground populations were solved through innovations that combined traditional engineering principles with improvised solutions using salvaged materials. The social dynamics that developed in underground communities were necessarily different from those of surface settlements, as the confined space and shared dependence on artificial life support systems created intimacy and interdependence that could be either supportive or suffocating depending on the personalities involved. The leaders who emerged in these communities were typically those who combined technical expertise with the interpersonal skills necessary to mediate disputes in environments where conflicts could not be resolved through separation or exile. The The trade networks that connected underground communities with surface settlements required elaborate security measures to protect caravans from the mutated flora and fauna that controlled much of the transformed landscape. These trading expeditions often resembled military operations more than commercial ventures, with heavily armed guards outnumbering actual traders and elaborate protocols developed for dealing with the various biological hazards that might be encountered during surface travel. The cultural preservation efforts that characterized many South American communities reflected conscious decisions to maintain traditions and knowledge that provided psychological stability in an environment where most familiar reference points had been destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. The indigenous knowledge systems that had been marginalized by colonial and post-colonial governments gained new relevance in the post-war world, where traditional techniques for dealing with hostile environments and dangerous wildlife proved more effective than the industrial approaches that had failed so catastrophically. The religious movements that emerged from the trauma of post-war South America often incorporated elements of indigenous spirituality with Christian traditions and entirely new beliefs developed specifically to address the unprecedented challenges of survival in a transformed world. These syncretic faiths provided explanations for the suffering and destruction that survivors had witnessed, while offering hope for eventual recovery or transcendence that made continued struggle seem worthwhile. The children who grew up in the post-war South American environment developed capabilities and perspectives that set them apart from both their parents and children growing up in other parts of the world. Their education combined practical survival skills with cultural knowledge, creating a generation that was simultaneously rooted in traditional ways of thinking and adapted to post-war realities. These children learned to navigate environments that would have been nightmarish to their grandparents, treating carnivorous plants and fungal infections as normal hazards rather than existential threats. The artwork and literature that emerged from post-war South American communities often depicted the transformed environment with a combination of horror and fascination that reflected the complex relationships survivors had developed with their dangerous but still beautiful homeland. The poetry and songs that celebrated survival in the Green Hell often contained imagery that would have been incomprehensible to pre-war audiences, but conveyed profound meaning to people who had learned to find beauty in landscapes, where death lurked behind every tree. As decades passed, and the immediate crisis of post-war survival gradually gave way to more stable forms of existence, the South American wasteland began to develop its own unique character, distinct from the other post-war societies emerging around the globe. The combination of environmental hostility and cultural resilience created communities that were simultaneously harder and more compassionate than their counterparts in other regions, bound together by shared understanding of what it meant to survive in a world where nature itself had become an enemy that must be respected even as it was feared and fought. Turn your gaze now across the Atlantic, where the ancient continent that had given birth to Western civilization struggled to maintain its identity as familiar landmarks disappeared beneath radioactive rubble and the political structures that had governed European life for centuries crumbled into warring fragments. The European Commonwealth, which had once represented the pinnacle of international cooperation and shared governance, existed now only in the memories of survivors who had lived through its dissolution and the catastrophic conflicts that had preceded the global nuclear exchange. The story of Europe's transformation began not with the bombs that fell on October 23, 2077, but with the resource wars that had consumed the continent's wealth and moral authority during the decades preceding the Great War. The invasion of the Middle East that had marked Europe's entry into the age of nuclear warfare was remembered not as a noble crusade for energy security, but as the moment when European civilization chose conquest over cooperation, violence over diplomacy, and short-term gain over long-term survival. The nuclear weapons that European forces had dropped on Middle Eastern cities during their attempted conquest of the region's oil resources carried a symbolic weight that exceeded their immediate military impact. These were the first atomic weapons used in anger since the 20th century, breaking taboos that had restrained international behavior for over a century and establishing precedents that would make the global nuclear exchange almost inevitable. The European Commonwealth that authorized these attacks had crossed a moral threshold from which there could be no return to the high-minded principles that had once defined the Union's mission and purpose. The collapse of the European Commonwealth was not a single dramatic event, but a gradual process of fragmentation that accelerated as the resource wars intensified and the international situation deteriorated. The unity that had once enabled European nations to speak with a single voice in international affairs evaporated as individual countries prioritized their own survival over collective action. The institutions that had mediated disputes between member states were abandoned when those same states began viewing each other as competitors for increasingly scarce resources rather than partners in a shared endeavor. The nuclear arsenals that France and the United Kingdom had maintained, even after European integration, became sources of both security and vulnerability as the global situation moved toward inevitable conflict. These weapons provided their possessors with the ability to deter, attack, and project power beyond their immediate borders, but they also made their countries primary targets when the exchange began. The decision to maintain independent nuclear forces rather than relying solely on collective security arrangements reflected the fundamental lack of trust that had always undermined European unity despite decades of integration. Efforts. The targeting priorities that enemy strategists applied to European cities during the Great War reflected both the continent's military capabilities and its symbolic importance as the birthplace of the industrial civilization that had ultimately destroyed itself through nuclear warfare. London, Paris, Berlin, Rome, and other major cities were not just political and economic centers, but cultural repositories that represented thousands of years of human achievement in art, literature, science, and philosophy. Their destruction marked not just military victories, but the deliberate erasure of cultural heritage that had shaped human development for millennia. The survivors who emerged from the rubble of European cities found themselves inheritors of a continent where familiar landmarks had been reduced to radioactive craters and the political boundaries that had defined national identity for centuries had become meaningless lines on maps that no longer corresponded to any governmental authority. The nation-states that had dominated European politics since the Renaissance were replaced by city-states and tribal federations that controlled whatever territory their armed forces could defend against rivals and raiders. The evidence of European survival that appeared in the American wasteland provided tantalizing glimpses of what had transpired across the Atlantic, though the full story remained largely hidden behind the ocean barrier that made transatlantic communication and travel extraordinarily difficult in the post-war world. The immigrants who had somehow managed to cross thousands of miles of dangerous ocean carried with them not just their distinctive accents but fragments of information about the societies they had left behind and the circumstances that had motivated their desperate journeys to the new world. Colin Moriarty, the Irish pub owner whose establishment in Megaton served as a gathering place for wasteland survivors, represented the preservation of cultural identity that characterized European survivors' approach to post-war existence. His accent and mannerisms were not just personal characteristics but conscious choices to maintain connections to a homeland that might no longer exist in any recognizable form. The pub itself served not just as a business enterprise but as a cultural institution that preserved traditions of hospitality and community gathering that had characterized Irish society for centuries. The stereotypes and cultural markers that European immigrants carried with them to the American wasteland were both authentic expressions of their heritage and deliberate constructions designed to maintain group identity in an environment where individual survival often required assimilation into larger communities. The Irish alcoholism that characterized some immigrants was not just a personal failing, but a cultural response to trauma and displacement that served both as coping mechanism and as marker of group membership that distinguished European survivors from the American-born populations they encountered. Kate, the Irish immigrant whose problems with substance abuse made her a complex and troubled companion for Commonwealth survivors, embodied the psychological challenges that European refugees faced in adapting to American wasteland conditions while maintaining their cultural identity. Her struggles were not just personal failures, but reflections of the broader difficulties that displaced populations experienced when trying to rebuild their lives in environments that were simultaneously familiar and alien, where their cultural knowledge was sometimes valuable and sometimes completely irrelevant to survival needs. Alistair Tenpenny's successful ocean crossing demonstrated that European maritime capabilities had not been completely destroyed by the nuclear exchange, though the exact nature of the ships and navigation systems that enabled such voyages remained largely mysterious to American observers. His arrival in the capital wasteland represented not just individual ambition, but evidence of organized societies capable of supporting long-distance exploration and trade despite the obvious dangers and difficulties involved in crossing a radioactive ocean where normal navigation aids were no longer functional. The cruel and exploitative behavior that Tenpenny exhibited in his dealings with American wasteland communities reflected not just personal character flaws but broader changes in European social values that had accompanied the continent's transformation from civilized societies to survival-focused communities, where strength and ruthlessness were valued above the humanitarian principles that had once defined European identity. His willingness to displace established communities for his own benefit demonstrated how post-war conditions had stripped away moral constraints that might have limited such behavior in the pre-war world. The naval capabilities that had enabled Tenpenny's ocean crossing suggested the existence of European shipbuilding and maintenance facilities that could support vessels capable of surviving the storms and radioactive waters that made transatlantic travel extraordinarily dangerous. These ships were likely not graceful sailing vessels or sleek pleasure craft, but massive, heavily armored vessels designed to withstand both natural hazards and potential attacks from sea creatures that had been mutated by decades of exposure to radioactive contamination. The city ships that patrolled European waters represented a logical adaptation to post-war conditions where traditional land-based communities were vulnerable to attack and contamination, while mobile platforms could avoid concentrations of radiation and hostile forces through constant movement. These floating cities combined the defensive advantages of naval vessels with the social structures necessary to support permanent populations, creating communities that were simultaneously military units and civilian settlements. The English Channel, which had served as a natural barrier protecting Britain from continental invasions for centuries, became in the post-war period a highway for maritime commerce and communication between surviving European communities. The naval patrols that maintained security in these waters were not just military exercises but essential infrastructure that enabled trade and cultural exchange between populations that might otherwise have been isolated by the dangers of overland travel through contaminated territories. The technology that enabled European ships to navigate radioactive oceans where conventional instruments were unreliable required innovations that combined traditional seamanship with post-war improvisations using salvaged materials and jury-rigged systems. The crews that operated these vessels possessed skills that were valued throughout the post-war world, as their expertise in dealing with radioactive environments and hostile sea life was applicable to many survival challenges beyond maritime operations. The German arms manufacturing legacy that had provided weapons to American forces during the pre-war period continued to influence post-war conflicts through the stockpiles of sophisticated equipment that survived the nuclear exchange in hardened facilities designed to withstand atomic attack. The factories that had produced everything from simple pistols to advanced energy weapons represented not just industrial capabilities but repositories of technical knowledge that could enable rapid reconstruction of military manufacturing. If the necessary resources and skilled workers could be assembled, the weapons exports that had flowed from German factories to American markets during the final years before the war demonstrated the extent to which European industrial capabilities had remained functional even as political institutions collapsed and resource shortages intensified. The quality and sophistication of these weapons suggested that German manufacturing had maintained standards that exceeded those of most other nations, probably through investment in automated production systems that reduced dependence on human workers whose availability was limited by military conscription and economic disruption. The stockpiles of advanced weapons that survived the war in German storage facilities would have made post-war Germany one of the most heavily armed regions in the world. But the question of whether this military potential would be used for conquest, defense, or internal conflict remained unanswered. The political fragmentation that had preceded the nuclear exchange made it unlikely that these weapons would be controlled by a single authority, suggesting instead that they would be distributed among multiple competing factions whose conflicts would determine the continent's future development. The professional military culture that had characterized German armed forces for generations provided a foundation for post-war organization that could have enabled rapid reconstruction of effective governmental institutions, but only if the military leadership survived the nuclear attacks and retained sufficient moral authority to command civilian obedience. The alternative was that military expertise would be employed by warlords and raider gangs, turning advanced weapons into tools of oppression rather than instruments of reconstruction. The metro tunnel systems that honeycombed the underground areas beneath major European cities provided ready-made shelter networks that could protect substantial populations from both radiation and surface conflicts. The Moscow metro, which had been constructed with military considerations in mind, was particularly well suited for post-war habitation, with stations and tunnels that were deep enough to provide protection from nuclear effects while being extensive enough to support permanent communities. The underground societies that developed in these metro systems faced unique challenges that shaped their cultural and political development in ways that were distinct from both surface settlements and other types of underground communities. The artificial lighting that was necessary for human habitation required constant maintenance and fuel supplies that were difficult to obtain, creating scarcity that influenced every aspect of social organization. The confined spaces made privacy impossible and forced communities to develop elaborate social protocols for managing conflicts that could not be resolved through physical separation. The darkness that characterized underground existence had psychological effects that accumulated over generations, creating populations that were adapted to artificial environments but poorly suited for surface life, even when radiation levels decreased to survivable levels. The children who were born and raised in the tunnels developed different sensory capabilities and social skills than their surface counterparts, making them valuable for certain types of work, but limiting their adaptability to different environmental conditions. The conflicts between tunnel communities often centered on control of strategic passages and vital infrastructure rather than traditional territorial disputes, as the three-dimensional nature of underground spaces created tactical situations that had no parallels in surface warfare. The communities that controlled major transportation hubs and electrical systems possessed advantages that could determine the outcome of conflicts across entire underground networks. making these locations the focus of elaborate political arrangements and military preparations. The mutant creatures that infested the deeper parts of the tunnel systems represented threats that could not be eliminated through conventional military action, as their numbers and reproductive capabilities exceeded anything that human communities could match through direct confrontation. The successful underground societies learned to coexist with these creatures through elaborate containment strategies and territorial agreements that treated the mutants as a dangerous but predictable environmental hazard rather than an co-mental enemy to be defeated. The trade relationships that connected underground communities with surface settlements required elaborate logistical arrangements to move goods between environments with completely different security requirements and survival challenges. The merchants who specialized in this inter-environmental commerce possessed skills and knowledge that made them valuable to both surface and tunnel communities, often serving as diplomatic intermediaries as well as commercial facilitators. The cultural activities that flourished in underground communities often emphasized audio rather than visual art forms, as the limitations of artificial lighting made traditional painting and sculpture less practical than music and storytelling. The acoustic properties of tunnel systems created unique opportunities for musical performance and sound-based entertainment that could not be replicated in surface environments, leading to the development of art forms that were specifically adapted to underground life. The technological innovations that emerged from underground communities often focused on resource conservation and recycling techniques that enabled maximum utilization of scarce materials. The engineering knowledge that was developed for maintaining tunnel systems under post-war conditions proved applicable to many other survival challenges, making underground survivors valuable advisors and workers for reconstruction projects in other environments. As decades passed and the immediate crisis of post-war survival gradually gave way to more stable forms of existence, the European wasteland began to develop characteristics that reflected both the continent's cultural heritage and the unique challenges of reconstruction in an environment where traditional resources and institutions were no longer available. The city-states and tribal federations that emerged from the rubble combined ancient forms of social organization with innovations that were specifically designed to address post-war survival needs, creating societies that were simultaneously familiar and utterly transformed by their experiences of nuclear devastation and social collapse. Let your consciousness drift now across vast distances to the cradle of humanity itself, where the ancient continent of Africa watched the world burn from a position that was both blessed and cursed by distance from the great powers whose nuclear arsenals had poisoned the earth. The vast savannas and dense forests that had witnessed the birth of human civilization now became refuges for those seeking to escape the radioactive ashes of modernity, though safety proved to be as elusive here as anywhere else in the transformed world. Africa's role in the global catastrophe had been largely that of victim rather than participant. Its vast mineral wealth extracted to fuel the war machines of distant superpowers, while its people remained excluded from the decisions that would ultimately determine the fate of all humanity. The uranium that powered American nuclear reactors had been torn from African soil by mining operations that left behind poisoned landscapes and impoverished communities. The rare earth metals that enabled Chinese military electronics had been stripped from African mountains by extraction operations that resembled colonial exploitation more than legitimate commerce. The colonial relationships that had supposedly ended with 20th century independence movements had been replaced by more subtle but equally exploitative arrangements that made African nations dependent on resource exports while preventing them from developing the industrial capabilities that might have enabled true economic independence. When the Great War severed these trade relationships overnight, African societies found themselves simultaneously freed from foreign domination and deprived of the economic foundations that had supported their governments and infrastructure for generations. The immediate aftermath of the nuclear exchange created opportunities for African societies that had been unimaginable during the decades of resource extraction and economic subordination. The collapse of international markets eliminated the pressure to export raw materials at prices dictated by foreign purchasers, while the destruction of colonial administrative systems removed the institutional barriers that had prevented African communities from controlling their own destinies. For the first time in centuries, African peoples could make decisions about their resources and their future without considering the demands of distant powers. The nuclear targeting that had devastated the major population centers of other continents was largely absent from Africa. Not because of any mercy on the part of nuclear strategists, but because the continent lacked the military installations and industrial complexes that had made other regions strategic priorities. The few nuclear weapons that did strike African targets were aimed at mining facilities and transportation hubs that served the resource extraction operations of foreign powers, rather than at population centers or cultural landmarks that might have represented African sovereignty and identity. The radioactive contamination that spread across much of the world through atmospheric circulation and ocean currents did reach Africa, but in concentrations that were generally lower than those experienced by populations closer to ground zero locations. This relative freedom from direct nuclear effects meant that African ecosystems retained much of their pre-war biodiversity, while other continents experienced massive die-offs and mutations that fundamentally altered their Phase 1c. Biological characteristics. The wildlife that had made Africa famous throughout the world continued to exist, though often in modified forms that reflected their exposure to global radioactive contamination. The survival advantages that African populations possessed in the post-war world were not just environmental but cultural, reflecting millennia of adaptation to harsh conditions and scarce resources. The traditional knowledge systems that had been marginalized by colonial education and industrial development suddenly became invaluable for communities trying to rebuild without access to the technology and infrastructure that had characterized modern civilization. The ability to find water in desert conditions, to identify edible plants in unfamiliar terrain, and to navigate by celestial observations proved more useful than university degrees in engineering or economics. The social structures that had enabled African communities to survive previous periods of disruption and conflict provided frameworks for organizing post-war reconstruction that were more flexible and resilient than the centralized, governmental systems that had collapsed elsewhere. The extended family networks that had been weakened by urbanization and wage labor reasserted themselves as primary sources of security and mutual aid when formal institutions proved unable to meet the challenges of post-war survival. The traditional councils and consensus-building processes that had governed African communities for generations adapted readily to the new problems created by global nuclear devastation. The mineral wealth that had made Africa a target for colonial exploitation remained in the ground after the foreign mining operations were abandoned. But now it belonged to the African communities that lived above these deposits rather than to distant corporations and governments. The gold, diamonds, platinum, and uranium that had once flowed out of the continent to enrich foreign powers could now be used to support local development priorities determined by African decision-makers rather than external market demands. The technical knowledge required to extract and process these mineral resources had been deliberately kept from African populations during the colonial period. But the abandoned mining facilities contained equipment and documentation that could be studied and eventually mastered by communities with the time and motivation to acquire these skills. The process of learning to operate complex machinery without formal training was slow and dangerous, but it offered the possibility of economic independence that had been denied to African societies for centuries. The environmental restoration that became possible once destructive mining operations ceased provided opportunities for African communities to develop sustainable relationships with their natural resources that balanced immediate needs with long-term ecological health. The traditional conservation practices that had been abandoned during periods of intensive extraction were revived and adapted to address the challenges of managing resources in a world where global trade networks no longer existed to provide alternative sources of essential materials. The wildlife populations that had been decimated by habitat destruction and poaching during the resource extraction period began to recover once the economic pressures that had driven overexploitation were removed by the collapse of courting international markets. The elephants, rhinos, and other large mammals that had been hunted nearly to extinction for their ivory and horn found refuge in areas where human populations were too busy with survival to engage in commercial hunting, while the absence of industrial pollution allowed damaged ecosystems to begin healing processes that would take decades to complete. The mutations that did affect African wildlife were generally less severe than those observed in other continents, possibly because of lower radiation exposure levels or perhaps due to genetic factors that made African species more resistant to radioactive contamination. The animals that emerged from the post-war period were recognizably descended from their pre-war ancestors, though they often displayed enhanced size, intelligence, or sensory capabilities that made them both more impressive and more dangerous than their historical counterparts. The colonial military installations that had been abandoned when foreign powers withdrew their forces to deal with domestic crises provided African communities with access to weapons and equipment that could be used for hunting, defense, and reconstruction activities. These facilities often contain not just military hardware but technical manuals, communication equipment, and other resources that prove valuable for communities attempting to rebuild without external assistance. The challenge was learning to operate and maintain sophisticated equipment without the training programs and support networks that had been available to the original users. The cultural fusion that occurred when abandoned colonial personnel interacted with African communities created unique social dynamics that reflected both the legacy of colonialism and the unprecedented circumstances of post-war survival. Some foreign military units and civilian administrators who were stranded when evacuation became impossible chose to integrate with local communities rather than attempting to return to homelands that might no longer exist. These relationships were complicated by historical grievances and power imbalances, but they also offered opportunities for knowledge transfer and cultural exchange that might not have been possible under normal circumstances. The hybrid societies that emerged from these interactions combined African traditional knowledge with technical skills and equipment inherited from colonial installations, creating communities that possessed capabilities that exceeded what either group could have achieved independently. The success of these integrated communities depended largely on the willingness of all participants to abandon previous assumptions about racial and cultural superiority and to focus instead on the practical requirements of mutual survival and prosperity. The isolationist enclaves that chose to maintain colonial cultural practices and social structures, despite their abandonment by their home governments, represented alternative approaches to post-war adaptation that emphasized the preservation of familiar institutions rather than integration with local populations. These communities often struggled with resource limitations and recruitment problems that made long-term survival questionable, but they also served as repositories of technical knowledge and cultural traditions that might otherwise have been lost entirely. The educational initiatives that developed in both integrated and isolationist communities reflected different philosophies about the relative value of traditional knowledge and modern technical skills. Some communities emphasized the teaching of practical survival techniques and traditional crafts that could be maintained without access to industrial infrastructure, while others focused on preserving scientific and engineering knowledge that might prove essential for eventual technological reconstruction, even if it had limited immediate practical application. The trade networks that connected African communities with each other and with survivors in other regions developed gradually as transportation systems were rebuilt and communication links were re-established. The goods that Africa could export to other post-war societies included not just traditional products like gold and diamonds, but manufactured items created using techniques that combined traditional craftsmanship with salvaged materials and improvised technology. The caravans that carried these goods across dangerous territories required military escorts and elaborate logistical support that made long-distance commerce a complex and expensive undertaking. The agricultural innovations that emerged from post-war African communities often involved adaptations of traditional farming techniques to address the challenges of cultivating crops in soil that had been contaminated by radioactive fallout or damaged by destructive mining operations. The development of crop varieties that could thrive in compromised soil conditions while producing nutritious food for growing populations required experimentation that combined ancient agricultural wisdom with trial and error, approaches to plant breeding and soil management. The medical knowledge that African traditional healers possessed proved surprisingly effective for treating radiation sickness and other post-war ailments that had no precedent in modern medical practice. The herbal remedies and therapeutic techniques that had been dismissed by colonial medical establishments as primitive superstition demonstrated their value when high-tech medical facilities were no longer available. The integration of traditional healing practices with salvaged medical equipment and supplies created healthcare systems that were adapted to post-war conditions while remaining accessible to populations that lacked formal medical training. The artistic traditions that had survived the colonial period experienced renaissance in the post-war environment, where the time and materials for creative expression were often more available than they had been during periods of intensive resource extraction and forced labor. The sculptures, paintings, music, and literature that emerged from post-war African communities reflected both traditional cultural themes and new subjects inspired by the transformed world in which their creators lived. These artistic works served not just as entertainment, but as methods of processing trauma and preserving cultural memory for future generations. The population movements that occurred within Africa as communities relocated to take advantage of new opportunities or escape environmental hazards created mixing of ethnic groups and cultural traditions that had been separated by colonial boundaries and administrative policies. These migrations often led to conflicts over territory and resources, but they also facilitated cultural exchange and innovation that enriched the societies that emerged from the post-war reconstruction period. As decades passed and the immediate crisis of post-war survival gradually gave way to more stable forms of social organization, African societies began to develop characteristics that reflected both their traditional heritage and their unique experiences of liberation from colonial domination, followed by global nuclear catastrophe. The communities that emerged were simultaneously more traditional and more innovative than their pre-war predecessors, combining ancient wisdom with modern capabilities in ways that created new possibilities for human development that had been impossible under either colonial rule or the global economic system that had preceded the Great War. Cast your gaze now eastward to the ancient lands between the rivers, where civilization itself had been born in the fertile valleys that cradled humanity's first cities, and where survivors now sought to rebuild what had been lost by returning to the fundamental principles that had enabled their ancestors to transform wilderness into gardens and villages into empires. The Middle East, which had already endured nuclear devastation during the resource wars that preceded the Great War, possessed advantages that few other regions could claim. Experience with atomic destruction and the underground infrastructure necessary to survive its aftermath. The nuclear weapons that had fallen on Middle Eastern cities during the European Commonwealth's invasion had served as a terrible preview of what would later engulf the entire world. But they had also provided the survivors of those attacks with knowledge and experience that proved invaluable when global nuclear exchange transformed the international situation from regional conflict to worldwide catastrophe. The communities that had learned to live with radioactive contamination, to treat radiation sickness, and to rebuild infrastructure damaged by atomic weapons possessed capabilities that made them uniquely qualified to thrive in the post-war environment. The underground tunnel networks that had been constructed during the European invasion were originally designed as military fortifications and civilian shelters, but they evolved over the years into elaborate subterranean cities that could support large populations indefinitely without depending on surface resources or favorable weather conditions. These tunnel systems represented some of the most sophisticated underground construction projects ever completed, combining ancient Middle Eastern architectural traditions with modern engineering techniques to create environments that were both functional and psychologically comfortable for permanent habitation. The depth of these tunnel systems provided protection not just from nuclear weapons and radioactive fallout, but from the extreme temperature variations that characterized the post-war Middle Eastern climate. The nuclear winter that had settled over much of the world created conditions where surface temperatures could fluctuate dramatically between day and night, making underground habitation attractive even for communities that were not directly threatened by radiation or military attack. The stable temperatures maintained in deep tunnels eliminated the energy costs associated with heating and cooling surface structures while providing security that could not be achieved in conventional buildings. The engineering challenges that had been overcome during the construction of these underground cities demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything that most post-war societies could achieve using salvaged materials and improvised techniques. The ventilation systems that provided fresh air to tunnel networks extending for miles required sophisticated understanding of airflow dynamics and mechanical engineering. The water supply and sewage systems that served underground populations needed to function reliably without access to the pumps and treatment facilities that supported surface cities during the pre-war period. The social organization that developed in underground Middle Eastern communities was necessarily different from surface societies, as the confined spaces and shared dependence on artificial life support systems created interdependence that influenced every aspect of daily life. The leadership structures that emerged emphasized technical expertise and resource management skills rather than traditional markers of status or authority, since survival depended on the effective operation of complex systems that required specialized knowledge to maintain and repair. The cultural preservation efforts that characterized underground Middle Eastern societies reflected conscious decisions to maintain traditions and knowledge that provided psychological stability and community cohesion despite the kleeability, artificial environment in which they lived. The religious practices that had sustained Middle Eastern peoples for millennia were adapted to underground conditions while retaining their essential spiritual and social functions. The languages, stories, and customs that defined ethnic and national identity were carefully maintained, even when their practical relevance to daily survival was limited. The advantages that Middle Eastern survivors possessed due to their depleted oil reserves proved to be more significant than anyone had anticipated during the resource wars that had devastated the region. The petroleum deposits that had made the Middle East a target for invasion and exploitation had been largely exhausted by the time of the Great War, eliminating the economic incentives that might have justified continued nuclear targeting by powers seeking to control energy resources. The absence of valuable oil reserves made the region strategically unimportant to global powers that were focused on securing resources for their own survival. The agricultural potential that existed between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers had been obscured by centuries of focus on petroleum extraction and export. but it remained intact despite the nuclear devastation that had affected other aspects of Middle Eastern society. The fertile soil that had supported the world's first civilizations retained its agricultural value, requiring only the removal of radioactive contamination and the reconstruction of irrigation systems to resume productive farming. The communities that undertook this agricultural restoration were following in the footsteps of their Mesopotamian ancestors who had transformed the same landscape from wilderness into the garden of the ancient world. The archaeological heritage that lay beneath Middle Eastern soil provided not just cultural connections to the past, but practical knowledge about techniques and technologies that had enabled previous civilizations to thrive in harsh environmental conditions. The ancient irrigation systems that had supported Mesopotamian agriculture were studied and recreated using modern materials and construction methods, while traditional building techniques were adapted to address the challenges of construction using salvaged materials and limited energy resources. The religious traditions that had originated in the Middle East and spread throughout the world took on new significance in the post-war environment, where their emphasis on survival, renewal, and hope for eventual redemption resonated with communities struggling to rebuild in the aftermath of global catastrophe. The monotheistic faiths that had emerged from the region centuries earlier provided frameworks for understanding suffering and loss that helped survivors process the trauma of nuclear devastation while maintaining belief in the possibility of eventual recovery and restoration. The desert survival techniques that Middle Eastern peoples had developed over millennia of living in arid conditions proved immediately applicable to post-war situations where water was scarce, temperatures were extreme, and conventional agricultural methods were ineffective. The knowledge of how to find groundwater in apparently barren terrain, how to construct shelters that remained cool during the day and warm at night, and how to preserve food and water for extended periods became valuable throughout the post-war world as other regions experienced desertification and resource scarcity. The trading networks that had connected Middle Eastern communities with distant regions for thousands of years provided templates for re-establishing commercial relationships once basic survival needs were met and surplus production became possible. The caravan routes that had carried goods across the ancient world were revived using modern transportation methods and security techniques. Though the goods being transported were often quite different from the silks and spices that had characterized pre-war Middle Eastern commerce. The medical knowledge that Middle Eastern scholars had preserved from ancient Greek, Persian, and Islamic sources proved surprisingly relevant to the treatment of radiation sickness and other post-war ailments that had no precedent in modern medical practice. The herbal remedies and therapeutic techniques that had been marginalized by industrial medicine demonstrated their effectiveness when high-tech medical facilities were no longer available, while the emphasis on preventive care and community health that characterized traditional Middle Eastern medicine was well suited to the resource constraints of post-war healthcare systems. The craftsmanship traditions that had made Middle Eastern artisans famous throughout the world continued to flourish in the post-war environment, where the time and materials for decorative arts were often more available than they had been during periods of intensive industrialization and resource extraction. The carpets, metalwork, ceramics, and jewelry that emerged from post-war Middle Eastern workshops combined traditional techniques with new designs that reflected the experiences and aspirations of communities that had survived nuclear devastation and were working to rebuild their civilization. The linguistic diversity that had characterized the Middle East for millennia created both challenges and opportunities for post-war reconstruction, as communities that spoke different languages needed to develop communication methods while preserving their distinct cultural identities. The Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Kurdish languages that had coexisted in the region for centuries provided vocabularies and concepts that were well suited to describing post-war conditions and organizing reconstruction activities, while their literary traditions offered models for documenting and processing the experiences of nuclear survival and social rebuilding. The architectural innovations that emerged from post-war Middle Eastern construction projects combined traditional design principles with modern materials and techniques to create buildings that were adapted to the specific challenges of reconstruction in a radioactively contaminated environment. The courtyard houses and wind towers that had provided comfort in desert climates for centuries were modified to include radiation shielding and air filtration systems, while traditional construction materials like mud, brick, and stone were supplemented with salvaged steel and concrete to create structures that could withstand both environmental hazards and potential military attack. The governmental structures that developed in rebuilt Middle Eastern communities often drew upon both ancient Mesopotamian administrative traditions and Islamic legal principles to create systems of law and governance that were suited to the specific needs of small communities struggling to maintain order and cooperation under difficult circumstances. These hybrid governmental systems emphasize consensus building and resource sharing while maintaining enough centralized authority to coordinate large-scale reconstruction projects and defense against external threats. The scientific knowledge that Middle Eastern scholars had contributed to human understanding during the Islamic Golden Age provided foundations for post-war research and development activities that focused on practical problems like water purification, agricultural improvement, and industrial reconstruction. The emphasis on observation and experimentation that had characterized medieval Islamic science proved well suited to the trial-and-error approaches that were necessary when rebuilding technology without access to formal research institutions or industrial infrastructure. The strategic location that had made the Middle East a crossroads of world trade and cultural exchange retained its importance in the post-war world, where the region served as a bridge between African, European, and Asian survivor communities that were working to re-establish communication and commerce across the radioactive wastelands that separated population centers. The geographic advantages that had made cities like Baghdad and Damascus important throughout history continued to provide benefits for communities that could control transportation routes and communication networks. The population movements that occurred within the Middle East as communities relocated to take advantage of underground shelter systems or agricultural opportunities created mixing of ethnic and religious groups that had been separated by political boundaries and sectarian conflicts during the pre-war period. These migrations often led to tensions over territory and resources, but they also facilitated cultural exchange and cooperation that helped accelerate reconstruction efforts by combining the knowledge and skills of different communities. The energy resources that remained available in the post-war Middle East were not the petroleum deposits that had defined the region's economy for over a century, but rather the solar and wind power potential that had been overlooked during the era of fossil fuel abundance. The desert conditions that had made agriculture difficult provided ideal environments for solar energy collection, while the temperature differentials between day and night could be harnessed for power generation using techniques that required minimal industrial infrastructure to implement and maintain. As decades passed, and the immediate crisis of post-war survival gradually gave way to more stable forms of social organization, Middle Eastern societies began to develop characteristics that reflected both their ancient heritage and their unique experiences of surviving multiple waves of nuclear devastation. The communities that emerged combined traditional wisdom with innovative solutions to create civilizations that were simultaneously rooted in historical precedent and adapted to the unprecedented challenges of rebuilding human society world transformed by atomic fire and radioactive contamination. Turn your thoughts now to the vast frozen steppes that stretch across the northern reaches of the world's largest nation, where the hammer and sickle still flew above government buildings when the bombs began to fall, and where survivors now huddle in the deepest tunnels ever carved by human hands, listening to the endless clicking of radiation detectors while the surface world above remains locked in nuclear winter that may never end. The Soviet Union, which had somehow survived the collapse that had claimed its historical counterpart in our timeline, found itself facing an enemy more implacable than any capitalist adversary: the eternal cold of atomic winter combined with radiation levels that made the surface uninhabitable for generations to come. The survival of the Soviet Union into 2077 had been achieved through adaptations and reforms that had preserved the essential structure of communist governance while allowing sufficient flexibility to compete with the technological and economic challenges posed by American capitalism and Chinese authoritarianism. The massive nuclear arsenal that the Soviets had maintained throughout the decades of détente and occasional cooperation with the West represented both their insurance policy against foreign aggression and their ticket to participation in Immerse, the global nuclear exchange that would ultimately destroy the civilization they had sought to protect. The targeting priorities that American and Chinese strategists applied to Soviet territory during the Great War reflected both the military threat posed by the world's second-largest nuclear arsenal and the symbolic importance of destroying the communist experiment that had challenged capitalist assumptions about human nature and social organization for over a century. The missiles that fell on Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and dozens of other major cities were not just weapons of mass destruction but instruments of ideological warfare designed to eliminate forever the alternative to market-based economic systems that the Soviet Union represented. The retaliation that Soviet forces launched against their attackers was swift and overwhelming, reflecting decades of military planning that had assumed the inevitability of nuclear conflict and had prepared for the possibility of fighting and winning a global atomic war. The submarine-based missiles that struck American and Chinese targets represented only a fraction of the Soviet nuclear arsenal, as land-based systems and strategic bombers added their payloads to the exchange that would transform the entire northern hemisphere into a radioactive wasteland where normal human life was no longer possible. The nuclear winter that descended upon Soviet territory in the months following the Great War was more severe and long-lasting than similar conditions in other regions, partly because of the higher latitude that made the territory more susceptible to climatic disruption, and partly because of the sheer number of nuclear weapons that had been detonated on Soviet soil. The combination of radioactive fallout and atmospheric disruption created weather patterns that blocked sunlight for years rather than months, turning what had once been productive agricultural regions into frozen wastelands where temperatures rarely rose above freezing even during summer months. The immediate aftermath of the nuclear exchange found Soviet survivors facing challenges that exceeded anything their society had experienced during the worst periods of war, revolution, or economic disruption. The centralized planning system that had enabled the Soviet economy to function despite resource constraints and technological limitations was rendered useless when the communication networks and transportation systems that connected regional planning authorities were severed by nuclear attack. The collective farms and state-owned industries that had provided employment and sustenance for millions of people were abandoned as their workers fled to underground shelters or died from radiation exposure. The metro tunnel systems that honeycombed the underground areas beneath major Soviet cities had been constructed with both civilian transportation and military defense considerations in mind, making them ideally suited for conversion into permanent underground habitats. The Moscow Metro, which had been expanded repeatedly during the decades preceding the war, provided a ready-made shelter network that could protect substantial populations from both radiation and the extreme cold that characterized the post-war surface environment. The depth of the metro tunnels, which averaged 250 feet below ground level, provided protection that exceeded the capabilities of most purpose-built fallout shelters, while offering the space and infrastructure necessary to support communities rather than just individuals. The electrical systems that had powered the pre-war subway trains could be adapted to provide lighting and ventilation for permanent residents, while the maintenance shops and storage areas could be converted into workshops and living spaces that made underground civilization possible rather than just survival. The social dynamics that developed in the underground metro communities were necessarily different from surface Soviet society, as the confined spaces and shared dependence on artificial life support systems created interdependence that influenced every aspect of daily life. The party officials and government bureaucrats who had administered the pre-war Soviet system often lacked the technical skills necessary for maintaining tunnel systems and operating the improvised technologies that kept underground communities functional, leading to the emergence of new leadership hierarchies based on practical expertise rather than political authority. The psychological challenges of permanent underground existence were more severe in Soviet tunnel communities than in other underground settlements, partly because of the scale of the tunnel systems that allowed large populations to live their entire lives without seeing natural sunlight or breathing unfiltered air. The children who were born and raised in the metro tunnels developed different sensory capabilities and social patterns than their surface ancestors, becoming adapted to artificial environments in ways that made them uniquely qualified for underground survival, but poorly suited for surface life, even when radiation levels eventually decreased to survivable ranges. The ideological continuity that some metro communities attempted to maintain with pre-war Soviet values and institutions created tensions between those who sought to preserve the communist system that had defined their former lives, and those who argued that post-war conditions required entirely new approaches to social organization and resource distribution. The collective ownership principles that had characterized Soviet economic policy proved difficult to implement when resources were so scarce that individual hoarding could determine the difference between community survival and slow starvation. The conflicts between different metro stations and tunnel networks often reflected pre-war political divisions and ethnic tensions that had been suppressed by Soviet authority but had never been fully resolved. The Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, and dozens of other ethnic groups that had been unified under Soviet rule found themselves competing for scarce resources and territorial control in underground environments where cooperation was essential for survival, but trust was undermined by memories of historical grievances and contemporary resource disputes. The military equipment and weapons stockpiles that had been stored in underground facilities throughout the Soviet Union provided tunnel communities with access to sophisticated armaments that could be used for defense against hostile surface dwellers or for conflicts with neighboring underground settlements. The challenge was maintaining and operating complex weapon systems without access to the industrial infrastructure and technical support that had been available during the pre-war period, requiring improvisation and innovation that combined traditional Soviet engineering capabilities with post-war resourcefulness. The technological innovations that emerged from metro communities often focused on resource conservation and recycling techniques that enabled maximum utilization of scarce materials in closed-loop systems where waste products had to be processed and reused rather than disposed of through normal environmental processes. The engineering knowledge that Soviet technical schools had provided to generations of students proved invaluable for solving problems like air filtration, water purification, and food production that were essential for underground survival but had no precedent in pre-war urban planning. The cultural preservation efforts that characterized many tunnel communities reflected conscious decisions to maintain traditions and knowledge that provided psychological stability and community identity despite the artificial environment in which they lived. The literature, music, and art that had defined Soviet cultural achievements were carefully maintained through oral transmission and improvised performances, while new creative works were developed that addressed the unique experiences of underground survival and the psychological challenges of permanent separation from the natural world. The trade relationships that developed between different metro stations and tunnel networks required elaborate protocols for managing commercial exchanges in environments where the movement of goods and people was constrained by the physical limitations of tunnel systems and the security requirements of communities that could not afford to trust strangers. The merchants who specialized in interstation commerce possessed knowledge of tunnel geography and community politics that made them valuable, not just as traders, but as sources of information about conditions throughout the cruise. Underground network. The agricultural innovations that tunnel communities developed for producing food in artificial environments combined traditional Soviet agricultural knowledge with improvisations that addressed the unique challenges of farming without natural soil, sunlight, or rainfall. The hydroponic systems and mushroom cultivation techniques that emerged from these experiments provided sustainable food sources that could support permanent underground populations while requiring minimal resources beyond human labor and Festjan's Indian mine. Ingenuity. The educational systems that developed in tunnel communities emphasized practical skills and technical knowledge that were immediately relevant to underground survival, while attempting to preserve broader cultural and scientific knowledge that might prove valuable for eventual surface reconstruction. The schools that operated in converted metro stations combined traditional academic subjects with hands-on training in tunnel maintenance, equipment repair, and resource management, creating curricula that were adapted to post-war conditions while maintaining connections to pre-war educational traditions. The medical capabilities that tunnel communities developed for treating radiation exposure and other post-war health problems combined traditional Soviet medical training with improvisations that addressed the unique challenges of PCEL. Healthcare in sealed underground environments. The hospitals and clinics that operated in converted tunnel facilities provided services that ranged from basic first aid to complex surgical procedures, using equipment and supplies that were maintained through elaborate recycling and improvisation programs. The religious activities that flourished in some tunnel communities reflected both the revival of traditional Orthodox Christianity that had been suppressed during the Soviet period and the development of new spiritual movements that addressed the unique psychological needs of people living in permanent exile from the natural world. The churches and prayer groups that met in tunnel alcoves and abandoned stations provided comfort and community support that complemented the practical assistance offered by secular organizations and government authorities. The population movements that occurred within the tunnel systems as communities relocated to take advantage of better facilities or escape overcrowding created mixing of regional and ethnic groups that had been geographically separated. During the pre-war period, these migrations often led to conflicts over territory and resources, but they also facilitated cultural exchange and innovation that enriched the societies that emerged from the underground reconstruction period. The communication networks that connected different tunnel communities were based on improvised radio systems and messenger services that enabled the exchange of information about conditions throughout the underground network while maintaining the security protocols necessary to protect communities from hostile infiltration. The operators who maintained these communication systems possessed technical skills that made them valuable members of their communities while requiring them to maintain strict neutrality in inter-community conflicts to preserve their access to information sources. As decades passed and the immediate crisis of post-war survival gradually gave way to more stable forms of social organization, the Soviet tunnel communities began to develop characteristics that reflected both their communist heritage and their unique experiences of surviving nuclear devastation through underground exile. The societies that emerged combined collective decision-making traditions with innovations that were specifically designed to address the challenges of permanent artificial environments, creating communities that were simultaneously familiar and utterly transformed by their separation from the surface world that had given birth to human civilization. Travel now in your imagination across the vast Pacific Ocean, following the paths of intercontinental ballistic missiles that carried more destructive power than had ever been unleashed in the history of warfare, to the ancient Middle Kingdom that had emerged from centuries of foreign domination to become a global superpower, only to find itself bearing the full weight of American nuclear retaliation for its role in the Great War. China, which had possessed the world's largest population and one of its most sophisticated military establishments, became the most heavily bombed nation in human history when over 3,000 nuclear warheads transformed its cities into radioactive craters and its countryside into a wasteland that glowed with deadly light. The American invasion of mainland China that had been underway when the bombs began to fall represented the largest military operation ever attempted in human history, involving millions of soldiers engaged in combat across thousands of miles of territory that encompassed everything from subtropical forests to Arctic tundra. The amphibious landings that had established American footholds along the Chinese coast had been supported by air and naval forces that represented the full might of the American military-industrial complex, creating battlefields where the most advanced weapons in human history were employed in conflicts that resembled the total wars of previous centuries, but with destructive capabilities that exceeded anything that earlier generations could have imagined. The Chinese defensive strategy that had been implemented to resist the American invasion relied on the sheer size of the Chinese population and territory to absorb attacks while gradually wearing down American forces through attrition. Warfare that traded space for time and casualties for strategic advantage. The plan had assumed that Chinese industrial capabilities and population reserves would eventually enable them to outlast American offensive capacity, but it had not anticipated the possibility that the conflict would escalate to global nuclear exchange before conventional military operations could determine the outcome. The nuclear targeting that American strategists applied to Chinese territory during the Great War reflected both military necessity and vengeful determination to punish the Chinese leadership for their resistance to American expansion and Barbados, their challenge to American global hegemony. The 3,000 warheads that fell on Chinese targets were not randomly distributed, but were carefully aimed to achieve maximum destruction of population centers, industrial facilities, transportation networks, and agricultural regions that supported Chinese society and military capability. The immediate consequences of this unprecedented nuclear bombardment exceeded the worst-case scenarios that Chinese civil defense planners had developed for atomic warfare, as the sheer scale of destruction overwhelmed every system and institution that had been designed to maintain governmental authority and social order during wartime emergencies. The major cities that had served as centers of Chinese political and economic power were simply erased from existence, leaving behind radioactive craters where millions of people had lived and worked just hours before the attack began. The industrial complexes that had enabled Chinese economic development and military production were systematically destroyed through targeting that reflected intimate knowledge of Chinese infrastructure and manufacturing capabilities. The steel mills, chemical plants, electronics factories, and transportation hubs that had supported Chinese society were reduced to twisted metal and radioactive debris, eliminating the technological foundation that would have been necessary for rapid post-war reconstruction and ensuring that Chinese recovery would require decades rather than years. The agricultural regions that had fed China's massive population were contaminated with radioactive fallout that made farming impossible for generations. creating immediate food shortages that would have caused mass starvation even if other aspects of Chinese society had survived the nuclear attack intact. The irrigation systems and transportation networks that had distributed food from farming regions to urban populations were destroyed or rendered useless, while the fertilizers and pesticides necessary for intensive agriculture were no longer available from industrial sources that had been eliminated by nuclear bombardment. The millions of American soldiers who had been fighting on Chinese territory when the nuclear exchange began found themselves stranded in a hostile environment where their own government's actions had eliminated any possibility of evacuation or resupply through normal military channels. These troops faced immediate threats from radiation exposure, Chinese military units that continued to resist despite the devastation of their homeland, and the gradual breakdown of command structures as communication with American headquarters became impossible to maintain. The Chinese military forces that survived the initial nuclear bombardment were similarly isolated from their own government and supply systems. But they possessed advantages that their American opponents lacked, including familiarity with local terrain, potential support from civilian populations, and defensive positions that had been prepared for extended resistance against foreign occupation. The question of whether these surviving military units would continue to fight or would seek accommodation with their former enemies became one of the most important factors determining the future development of post-war Chinese society. The massive radiation exposure that characterized the Chinese wasteland created environmental conditions that were unlike anything that had existed elsewhere in the post-war world. As the concentration of nuclear detonations in a relatively small geographic area produced contamination levels that exceeded safe limits by factors of hundreds or thousands rather than the modest increases that characterized other regions. The mutations that resulted from this extreme radiation exposure were correspondingly more dramatic and more dangerous than those observed in other parts of the world. The ghoul populations that emerged from the most heavily contaminated areas of China were not just more numerous than similar populations elsewhere, but displayed characteristics that suggested fundamental changes in human physiology that went beyond the cosmetic alterations typically associated with radiation exposure. These Chinese ghouls often possessed enhanced physical capabilities, including improved strength, endurance, and sensory acuity that made them formidable opponents for normal humans, while also making them valuable for tasks that required operation in high radiation environments where unmodified humans could not survive. The wildlife mutations that occurred throughout the Chinese wasteland created ecosystems that were dominated by creatures that bore little resemblance to their pre-war ancestors and that posed constant threats to human survivors, regardless of their nationality or military affiliation. The pandas, tigers, and other iconic Chinese animals that had symbolized the country's natural heritage were transformed into monstrous predators that combined enhanced size and aggression with radiation-induced adaptations that made them nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. The cultural preservation efforts that characterized Chinese survivor communities reflected conscious decisions to maintain traditions and knowledge that provided psychological stability and group identity despite the devastating disruption of normal social institutions. The Confucian principles that had influenced Chinese society for over 2 millennia provided frameworks for organizing communities and resolving disputes that proved effective even when the governmental structures that had enforced these firmly principles were no longer functional. The technological capabilities that survived in scattered Chinese facilities provided foundations for post-war reconstruction that exceeded what most other regions possessed. As Chinese industrial development during the pre-war period had emphasized technological independence and domestic production capabilities that remained partially functional even after nuclear bombardment. The engineering knowledge and manufacturing equipment that could be salvaged from damaged facilities offered possibilities for rebuilding that might eventually restore Chinese society to something approaching its former capabilities. The language barriers that existed between Chinese survivors and stranded American military personnel created communication difficulties that complicated every aspect of their relationship, from basic survival cooperation to complex negotiations about territorial control and resource sharing. The few individuals who possessed bilingual capabilities became extraordinarily valuable as translators and negotiators, often determining whether interactions between the two groups would result in cooperation or continued conflict. The ideological differences that had motivated the war between China and the United States did not disappear when nuclear weapons destroyed the governmental systems that had promoted these conflicting worldviews, but they were modified by the practical requirements of survival in an environment where abstract political principles mattered less than immediate cooperation for mutual protection against radiation, hostile wildlife, and resource scarcity. The fusion of Eastern and Western cultural elements that occurred in communities where Chinese and American survivors learned to cooperate created hybrid societies that combined elements of both civilizations while developing innovations that were specific to post-war survival needs. These integrated communities often possessed advantages that purely Chinese or purely American groups lacked, as they could draw upon a broader range of knowledge and skills for solving problems and adapting to changing circumstances. The alternative scenario in which Chinese and American survivors remained permanently hostile to each other created the possibility of perpetual warfare between two populations that possessed extensive military equipment and training, but limited resources for sustaining extended conflicts. This ongoing struggle would have transformed the Chinese wasteland into a battlefield where both sides gradually destroyed themselves through attrition while preventing the recovery that might have been possible through cooperation and mutual assistance. The religious movements that emerged from the trauma of nuclear devastation often incorporated elements of traditional Chinese spirituality with Christian beliefs that had been brought to China by American missionaries and military personnel, creating syncretic faiths that addressed the psychological needs of survivors who were struggling to find meaning in circumstances that challenged every previous assumption about divine justice and human destiny. The trade relationships that developed between different Chinese survivor communities and between Chinese groups and American survivors required elaborate protocols for managing commercial exchanges in an environment where transportation was dangerous and trust was limited by memories of recent warfare and ongoing resource competition. The merchants who specialized in inter-community commerce possessed knowledge of local conditions and political dynamics that made them valuable not just as traders but as sources of information about developments throughout the Coast region. The medical knowledge that Chinese survivors possessed for treating radiation exposure and other post-war ailments proved valuable throughout the Chinese wasteland and could potentially be shared with survivor communities in other parts of the world if communication networks could be re-established. The traditional Chinese medical practices that emphasized herbal remedies and holistic treatment approaches often proved more effective than Western medical techniques for dealing with health problems that had no precedent in pre-war medical experience. The agricultural innovations that Chinese communities developed for producing food in contaminated soil combined traditional farming techniques that had sustained Chinese civilization for millennia with improvisations that addressed the Bonti unique challenges of cultivation in radioactive environments. The rice cultivation methods that had characterized Chinese agriculture for thousands of years proved surprisingly adaptable to post-war conditions. While traditional crop varieties often displayed greater resistance to radiation damage than the hybridized plants that had been favored during the industrial period. The population movements that occurred within China as survivors relocated to escape the most heavily contaminated areas or to take advantage of resources and opportunities in different regions created mixing of regional and ethnic groups. that had maintained distinct identities throughout Chinese history. These migrations often led to conflicts over territory and resources, but they also facilitated cultural exchange and innovation that enriched the societies that emerged from the post-war reconstruction period. The educational initiatives that developed in Chinese survivor communities emphasized both practical survival skills and the preservation of Chinese cultural heritage, creating curricula that prepared students for the challenges of post-war existence while maintaining connections to the intellectual traditions that had defined Chinese civilization. The schools that operated in improvised facilities using salvaged materials and volunteer teachers provided services that were essential for maintaining literacy and cultural continuity across generations that had been separated by nuclear catastrophe. As decades passed and the immediate crisis of post-war survival gradually gave way to more stable forms of social organization, Chinese survivor communities began to develop characteristics that reflected both their ancient cultural heritage and their unique experiences of surviving the most intensive nuclear bombardment in human history. The societies that emerged combined traditional Chinese values and institutions with innovations that were specifically designed to address the challenges of rebuilding civilization in an environment where radiation levels remained dangerously high and where the infrastructure that had supported pre-war Chinese society had been completely destroyed. Journey with me now across vast ocean waters to the isolated continent at the bottom of the world, where the land down under found itself thrust into a conflict not of its choosing, serving as a staging ground for forces beyond its control while its own people struggled to understand how their peaceful nation had become a launching pad for global devastation. Australia, which had maintained its reputation as a land where dangerous creatures lurked behind every tree and venomous death waited in every shadow, discovered that the end of the world had simply made these existing hazards exponentially more lethal, while adding entirely new threats that would have tested the survival skills of even the most experienced outback wanderers. The transformation of Australia, from a relatively peaceful nation focused on resource extraction and agricultural exports into a forward military base for American operations against China, had occurred gradually during the final years. Before the Great War, as escalating tensions between the superpowers forced smaller nations to choose sides in a conflict that would ultimately consume the entire world, the massive military installations that had been constructed along the Australian coast represented not just strategic assets for American forces but fundamental changes in Australian society and identity that would influence the nation's development long after the nuclear exchange had ended. The American military personnel who had flooded into Australia during the pre-war build-up brought with them not just weapons and equipment, but cultural attitudes and military doctrines that were often at odds with traditional Australian approaches to conflict resolution and international relations. The tensions that developed between American commanders who viewed Australia as merely another forward operating base and Australian officials who sought to maintain some degree of national sovereignty created political dynamics that complicated every aspect of the military partnership and would later influence how Australian survivors responded to the post-war challenges they faced. The nuclear targeting that Australia experienced during the Great War was limited compared to the devastation that had befallen the major combatant nations. But the weapons that did strike Australian targets were chosen with careful attention to their strategic importance for American military operations rather than their significance to Australian society and economy. The ports and airfields that had supported American forces were destroyed or heavily damaged, while the major population centres that defined Australian cultural and political identity were largely spared from direct nuclear attack. The radioactive contamination that reached Australia through atmospheric circulation and ocean currents was significant despite the continent's geographic isolation from the primary theatres of nuclear exchange. as the sheer scale of the global bombardment ensured that no part of the Earth's surface would remain completely unaffected by the fallout that would continue circulating for years after the last warhead had detonated. The unique weather patterns and ocean currents that characterized the southern hemisphere created contamination distributions that were difficult to predict and often concentrated fallout in areas that had seemed likely to escape serious exposure. The wildlife that had made Australia famous for its dangerous fauna underwent mutations that transformed creatures that had already been among the world's most venomous and aggressive into monsters that challenged every assumption about the limits of biological lethality. The spiders that had previously been merely deadly became capable of killing with toxins so potent that a single bite could incapacitate multiple victims, while their increased size allowed them to prey upon animals that had previously been too large to serve as spider food. The snakes that had characterized Australian bushland for millions of years evolved enhanced venom delivery systems and improved hunting strategies that made encounters with these creatures almost invariably fatal for humans who lacked immediate access to advanced medical treatment. The traditional Aboriginal knowledge about avoiding and treating snake bites proved inadequate when dealing with mutations that produced entirely new types of toxins and behavioral patterns that violated the natural laws that had governed human-snake interactions throughout history. The marine life that inhabited Australian coastal waters was affected by radioactive contamination in ways that created hazards for anyone foolish enough to venture into the ocean or even to walk along beaches where mutated sea creatures might emerge to hunt terrestrial prey. The great white sharks that had always been apex predators in Australian waters grew to sizes that allowed them to attack boats and coastal installations, while their enhanced aggression and reduced fear of humans made every encounter with the ocean a potentially fatal experience. The crocodiles that inhabited northern Australian waterways became even more formidable than their already impressive ancestors, developing enhanced armor plating and improved sensory capabilities that made them nearly impossible to avoid or defeat through conventional means. These mutated crocodiles demonstrated intelligence levels that approached those of mammals, enabling them to use tools and coordinate their attacks in ways that made them far more dangerous than their size and strength alone would suggest. The isolation that had protected Australia from many of the conflicts that had characterized world history became both an advantage and a disadvantage in the post-war period, as the continent's geographic separation from other land masses provided protection from external threats, while also limiting access to resources and knowledge that might have accelerated recovery efforts. The same ocean barriers that had prevented invasion also prevented trade and communication with other survivor communities, forcing Australian survivors to develop self-sufficient solutions to problems that might have been solved through international cooperation. The Aboriginal knowledge systems that had enabled Indigenous Australian populations to survive in harsh environments for over 40,000 years suddenly became relevant to non-Indigenous Australians who found themselves facing survival challenges that were similar to those that had shaped Aboriginal culture throughout its long history. The techniques for finding water in desert conditions, for identifying edible plants and animals, and for navigating vast distances using natural landmarks proved invaluable for survivors who could no longer depend on the technological infrastructure that had supported European settlement for the previous 2 centuries. The cultural integration that occurred between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal survivors was facilitated by the breakdown of the racial barriers and social hierarchies that had characterized Australian society during the pre-war period, as the immediate requirements of survival made ancestral skills more important than skin color or social status. The traditional owners of the land possessed knowledge that was essential for post-war survival, while European Australians possessed technological capabilities and industrial skills that could be adapted to post-war reconstruction needs. The mining operations that had dominated Australian economic development for generations provided post-war survivors with access to mineral resources that were essential for rebuilding technological capabilities. But the extraction and processing techniques required for utilizing these resources had to be simplified and adapted to operate without the complex industrial infrastructure that had characterized pre-war mining operations. The knowledge of geology and metallurgy that Australian engineers had accumulated during decades of resource extraction proved valuable for developing post-war industries that could support growing survivor communities. The agricultural innovations that Australian farmers developed for producing food in contaminated soil combined traditional farming techniques with improvisations that addressed the unique challenges of cultivation in environments where normal growing seasons had been disrupted by nuclear winter and where radioactive contamination made many traditional crops unsafe for human consumption. The hardy plants that had been developed for Australian climate conditions often proved more resistant to radiation damage than crops that had been optimized for more benign environments. The transportation networks that connected different regions of Australia were disrupted by nuclear attacks on key infrastructure points. But the vast distances and sparse population that had always characterized the continent made the reconstruction of these networks a lower priority than the development of local self-sufficiency in communities that could not depend on external supply lines. The road trains and aircraft that had moved goods across the continent were replaced by smaller-scale transportation systems that could operate with minimal technological support while providing essential connections between isolated communities. The communication systems that enabled different Australian survivor communities to maintain contact with each other were based on amateur radio networks and other low-technology solutions that could operate without the satellites and fiber optic cables that had supported pre-war telecommunications. The operators who maintained these communication networks possessed technical skills that made them valuable members of their communities while requiring them to maintain strict neutrality in inter-community disputes to preserve their access to information sources throughout the continent. The medical knowledge that Australian healthcare workers had developed for treating tropical diseases and trauma injuries proved surprisingly relevant to the treatment of radiation exposure and other post-war health problems. As the isolation that had forced Australian medical professionals to develop self-reliant approaches to healthcare created capabilities that were well suited to post-war conditions where advanced medical facilities were no longer available. The educational systems that developed in Australian survivor communities emphasized both practical survival skills and the preservation of cultural knowledge that provided psychological stability and community identity despite the disruption of normal social institutions. The schools that operated using volunteer teachers and salvaged materials provided services that were essential for maintaining literacy and technical knowledge across generations that had been separated by nuclear catastrophe. The governance structures that emerged in post-war Australian communities often drew upon both European political traditions and Aboriginal consensus-building practices to create systems of law and administration that were suited to the specific needs of small communities struggling to maintain order and cooperation under difficult circumstances. These hybrid governmental systems emphasized resource sharing and mutual assistance while maintaining enough centralized authority to coordinate large-scale reconstruction projects and defense against external threats. The artistic traditions that had defined Australian cultural identity continued to evolve in the post-war environment, with Aboriginal dot painting and storytelling traditions being combined with European artistic techniques to create new forms of expression that addressed the unique experiences of surviving nuclear catastrophe while maintaining connections to the cultural heritage that had sustained Australian society for generations. The religious movements that emerged from post-war Australian communities often incorporated elements of Aboriginal spirituality with Christian beliefs and entirely new faiths that were developed specifically to address the psychological needs of survivors who were struggling to find meaning in circumstances that challenged every previous assumption about divine justice and human destiny. The Dreamtime stories that had preserved Aboriginal knowledge for millennia provided frameworks for understanding trauma and loss that proved effective for survivors regardless of their ethnic background. The trade relationships that developed between different Australian communities and potentially with survivor groups in other parts of the Pacific region required the development of new commercial protocols and transportation methods that could operate safely in environments where normal shipping and aviation were no longer possible due to radiation hazards and the absence of navigation infrastructure. The population movements that occurred within Australia as communities relocated to escape contaminated areas or to take advantage of resources and opportunities in different regions created mixing of urban and rural populations that had maintained distinct lifestyles and skill sets throughout Australian history. These migrations often led to conflicts over territory and water rights, but they also facilitated knowledge transfer and cultural exchange that enriched the societies that emerged from the post-war Reconstruction period. The scientific research that continued in improvised facilities using salvaged equipment focused on practical problems like water purification, food safety, and radiation monitoring that were immediately relevant to survivor community needs, while attempting to preserve broader scientific knowledge that might prove valuable for eventual technological reconstruction. The universities that had characterized Australian intellectual life were replaced by informal education networks that emphasized hands-on learning and practical problem-solving skills. The maritime capabilities that Australian survivors developed for fishing and transportation had to account for the mutated sea life and radioactive contamination that made ocean activities extraordinarily dangerous while remaining essential for communities that depended on marine resources for protein and trade opportunities. The boats and ships that operated in post-war Australian waters were heavily armoured and equipped with weapons that could defend against sea creatures that were far more dangerous than anything that had existed in pre-war oceans. As decades passed and the immediate crisis of post-war survival gradually gave way to more stable forms of social organisation, Australian survivor communities began to develop characteristics that reflected both their unique geographic situation and their synthesis of Aboriginal and European cultural traditions adapted to post-war survival needs. The societies that emerged combined ancient wisdom about living in harmony with a hostile environment with modern technological capabilities and social structures that enabled them to thrive in conditions that would have defeated communities that possessed only one of these knowledge systems. As dawn breaks across our irradiated world, we've journeyed together through the ashes of nations and the birth of new civilizations. From the frozen metro tunnels of Russia to the mutated jungles of South America, from the warlord kingdoms of Canada to the underground cities of the Middle East, humanity endures in countless forms. Each nation's story reminds us that even in the darkest hours, life finds a way to continue. The same resilience that built the first cities along ancient rivers now builds new communities in the shadows of atomic craters. The courage that once crossed oceans now crosses irradiated wastelands in search of hope. Sleep now, knowing that somewhere across this transformed world, someone tends a fire against the darkness. Someone teaches a child to read by candlelight. Someone plants seeds in contaminated soil and dreams of harvest. The Great War ended one world, but from its ashes, 1,000 new worlds are being born. Rest peacefully in the knowledge that humanity's greatest strength was never its weapons or its cities, but its ability to find hope in hopelessness, to create beauty from destruction, and to begin again when all seems lost. Sweet dreams, survivor. Tomorrow's world awaits.